and welcome to this, the latest News Facebook Live interview. I'm joined today by John Brunson and Debi Rivers. John is the chairman of the Saving Children Revealing Secrets charity, SCARS, and Debi is the executive director. Thanks very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having us.
Talk a little bit about your work. Let's just start with this. Tell us a little bit about the charity. I mean, you're actually a very young charity. You're only 6 years old. So how did it start? And more pertinently, I suppose, why did it start?
Sure. I can answer that. My family was affected by this issue in 2004. Both of my children were sexually harmed by a trusted family member. And I say it all the time, I was left with a broken family. I was left with scarred children. And I was left with a passion for change. And so that's why SCARS was born. The more that I shared my story with other family and friends, the more others were telling me that it had happened to them and that they were scarred by the same issue. But because sexual abuse is very shameful, it was very difficult to talk about the issue. And I felt in my heart that in order to stop something and to prevent it, we have to educate ourselves on the issue. And that's why I flew to Atlanta and became a trained facilitator in an organization called Darkness to Light Stewards of Children, and it teaches adults how to recognize this and how to prevent it and how to react responsibly to it. So that's why SCARS was formed. It was really formed to create greater awareness of the devastation that child sexual abuse definitely causes in the life of a child, in the life of a family, and in the life of an entire community. Everybody's affected by sexual abuse.
What did you get involved in?
It's interesting. The crime of child sexual abuse has an impact on almost everyone in one way or another, whether directly or indirectly. And I have known Debi for almost 40 years. We went to school together. And a lot of times when you see the veneer of a person, you never know what is happening behind that. Debi and I met one day on the corner just near my office, and she was telling me about her story. And it was that point I said, you know, we need to continually advance this issue. I mean, Debi had already been was a champion of this issue, but it was to take it to the next level. And we met, we talked about the issue. Again, Debi shared her story with me. And also personally, in my political life, you know, you come across people who are impacted by this, and you always wonder whether you reacted responsibly to the issue. What I've learned now is there's things that we could have done better. There's a lot more information that should have been known to the public and to any concerned adult who cares about children. And it was obvious to me at that point in Debi and I's conversation that there was a real gap in Bermuda. And with Debi's passion, it was easy to, you know, get on board with really moving this from the shadows and into the forefront and starting the conversation.
It's interesting because it's such a difficult subject to deal with for all sorts of reasons. Have you found the people have been approachable? Have you found that they've been forthcoming and helping you and talking about their experiences?
I mean, I would say initially, and it's a typical response that you would expect around the subject of child sexual abuse, because for far too long it's been a taboo subject. People would rather move towards a path of least resistance. And that means just sweeping it under the carpet and hoping that it goes away.
I've seen that many times. It's come out historic child sexual abuse, you've seen it, but yeah. Definitely,
but what we know now, you know, and we've always known, is that sweeping it under the carpet is only a temporary holding ground for issues that will exponentially and progressively get worse if not dealt with. And, you know, we had to, and we felt that it was important to change the conversation and turn the taboo nature of talking about this crime of child sexual abuse and ensure that the shame should not rest with the victim. The shame should rest with the perpetrator. And to change that, it was about starting the conversation and educating people about the crime. And I'm going to say this probably a number of times in this interview, but child sexual abuse is a crime. You know, people were so ready to report when somebody steals their television or their wallet or their purse. When a child is affected by this crime, the tendency is to avoid dealing with it. statistics will tell us that more than 80% of the time the crime goes unreported. So a lot of times when we talk about this crime, it's on retrospective studies that have been conducted about who, how many have been involved and at what point in time in their life.
John talked about changing the conversation. Are you having an impact in that respect, do you think?
Oh, most definitely. I think we really are. I think organizations now are starting to get it and start to realize the risks that they have in their organizations if they don't get educated and learn about what they can do to minimize that risk in their organizations. I think families are talking about it more. I think we are now hearing more conversations around the dinner table, and people are really realizing that our country has really been affected by this issue because, and we know that by the many adults that have disclosed to us privately that this happened to them. Many times, we can't even say how many times during a week an adult would say, this happened to me and I never told. Some adults have told us their own spouse doesn't know. They've never even disclosed it. That's, the biggest thing about sexual abuse is the shame. There's a lot of shame that's attached to sexual abuse, and nothing silences us more than shame. And so where we're finding all this information now is through adults, because most children don't tell. They don't even really understand sometimes what happened to them. They don't understand it was wrong until they become an adult. Sometimes until they have their own children, or they hear this message for the first time and say, that happened to me and it really shouldn't have happened. And so we are seeing change, we are seeing impact. Even without legislative change, people are changing policies in their organizations. So we are creating an impact, we believe, in not only changing their policies in their organizations, but in helping to heal some adults that are being validated and saying, yeah, this shouldn't have happened to me, or I told and I wasn't believed. That's another one. Many adults have told the people in their lives, and it was just difficult to believe or deal with. It was just too traumatizing. And so it never really got resolved. And now they're getting validated that, yeah, this shouldn't have happened to me. Now I understand the issues that I have in my life as a result of what happened to me as a child.
You mentioned policies. Companies are changing policies. What do you mean by that? What's the kind of example of that?
Well, first I'd also like to just speak to the issue of impact before I address that question. And so impact sometimes has to be measured. And to date, we have trained over 6,050 adults in Bermuda, which represents more than 10% of the adult population. So when you look at statistically how do you measure impact, that shows impact. But behind those numbers, which I think is more important, is the motivation behind people receiving the Stewards of Children training, which is our certified program. And that is organizations without changes in legislation have made it mandatory for anyone that they have as a volunteer or as an employee must be trained in our Stewards of Children. That's impact. When you start looking at ads in the newspaper, and as a qualification to qualify for the position, they're saying must be SCAR certified. And so when you measure impact, it's not just looking at statistics, but it's the motivation behind that. And we think that Bermuda has now reached a tipping point where there is a behavioral shift in the mindset of people when it comes to child protection. And they recognize that preventative training helps them get ahead and create an appropriate framework for child protection. And they're taking personal ownership. And so, again, measuring impact, it's where leaders within organizations have made the decision that anyone that works, whether from a volunteer perspective or an employee that interacts with children, must be changed. Okay. And that is, that is impact. It's not just by numbers, but it's also by selective and purposeful action of leaders within organizations or within the community.
So these are the kind of policies people are saying you have to be SCAR certified.
So when you talk about policies, many of the organizations that we work with, we always start by talking about the framework of child protection that you have, and that framework is established by a code of conduct. And a code of conduct, once formulated within an organization, establishes a benchmark, a line of how you interact and the way you work with children. And it creates a tool for professionals, volunteers, employees to hold each other accountable. And so within that policy, it stipulates how you interact with children, things that you can do and things that you should not do. And the organization has to commit to it. I mean, it's one thing to have a policy, but it's another to have an organization that commits to that part of the policy so that it becomes a part of the organizational DNA in how it functions. And again, part of those things within the policy can be the rule of three. The rule of three says that you have 2 adults, 1 child, 2 children, 1 adult, 3 children. Why is that? Because we know that the highest risk to our children is a one-on-one situation. And so to minimize the isolated one-on-one situation with children, and so to minimize the opportunity, we would recommend working off of the rule of three. So the organizations implement things around that.
Yeah, and sometimes that's not always possible when you have tutoring or organizations or people with counseling. But what the words that Darkness to Light, they're the organization that created this amazing training program that we use here in Bermuda. What they say is, observable and interruptible. We want organizations to make sure, because the truth is, sex offenders, sometimes it's a career choice that they want to be around children. That's what they want. It's just like alcoholics that go into bars, or people that have a gambling addiction will go hang around casinos. That's what they want. That's where their thoughts are. That's what numbs out whatever they're trying to numb out on if they're addicted to it. And so it's the same with sex offenders. They will look for employment where there are children. And if they go to an organization that looks at the whole picture and says, we want to reduce risk in our organization, so we're going to do this training. We're going to make all our volunteers and people that work here have to be certified in sexual abuse prevention. We're going to institute a code of conduct and share that with the people that we work with and let them know what we expect of them when they're around children, their behavior. And we're going to do a background check, and we're going to do a reference check, and we're going to monitor adults and older children after we hire them. When you do all those things, you're reducing risk. And it's not only for the risk of the child, but it's for the adult that works there, so that they know where their behaviors may cross a line. And they need to know what their boundaries are when it comes to children. And they also need to be aware of, is there trauma in this child's life? What can we do to help this child? And so those are all the things that they learn in the training. And I think once organizations implement because it's not only the training, Jeremy, the whole thing is sex offenders can attend trainings. They don't walk in a training with a sign on their head that says, I'm a sex offender. And not all of them have been convicted or behind bars. And so we can't just say the training is, once you do the training, that's it, you have a safe environment. There's a lot of other steps that have to take place, and we just encourage any organization that is entrusted with children to take part in the training and then get recertified every 3 years. And the great news is there's no cost.
Right.
It's 3 hours of your time. SCARS is a nonprofit, and we are in this space to continuously raise funds so that there's no barrier, and that people, there's a charge to SCARS. We have to pay for the materials, but we want to be able to continuously be able to do this work so that nobody has to pay for this 3-hour certified training.
There's one thing I did want to clarify, and I think it's very important that I do that, and that is, as Debbie mentioned, isolated one-on-one. So I think that's very important for people to hear, because sometimes they hear one-on-one and then but it is isolated one-on-one scenarios, not to harp on that, but I just want to be very clear. About
one-on-one is important. Children need that.
Exactly, yeah.
But we just want to make sure it's observable and interruptible.
But within policies, you can create a framework around those types of scenarios and things that you can do from an environmental perspective, and just part of your policies, procedures, and controls as to how you manage that. And the key is always to minimize risk.
You talked about the mindset changing. It seems quite late in the day for the mindset to change. Is there a reason it's taken so long? Is that because of your work, or why is there not been an acceptance in society that this happens?
Well, I think it's the secrecy of it.
Right.
Now it's not okay if a child isn't believed, or if a child has got. I think it was the secrecy, the fact that it was swept under a rug, the fact that families didn't know how to deal with it. They really didn't even understand this issue, or maybe it happened to them, so they got over it. Now you should be able to get over it. And many times the adult hasn't gotten over it in the choices they've made. And I think the reason, we don't want to give SCARS all the credit. There's a lot of great agencies in Bermuda doing this work. But I think education has helped. And I think the Darkness to Light Stewards of Children training has really opened up the eyes of our people.
6,000 people is a lot.
Yeah, I would also say the mindset change. I mean, there's been a lot of people that have come before us that have been talking about the issue. But from our perspective, we have focused on prevention. And so there was a gap in the community in having that conversation about prevention, and then providing a real tangible way and tools that people can use in that vein. And I think that the approach of just focusing initially on prevention in a way that people were willing to hear and they could tangibly see how they could utilize the tools, help to accelerate and really expand our message within the community.
Yeah, and the other thing is our training uses people telling their stories.
Right, real people.
We cannot dispute
Real
experience.
Are they real stories?
Mm-hmm. They're real stories, and once you hear a real story and you see how it's affected somebody, you can't dispute that. And sometimes you're in the training and you say, wow, that happened to me, and that girl is telling my story. And I think once we break down walls of shame and start really opening up about our own pain, we can help others, and we can validate others to say, yeah, that happened to me too, and that shouldn't have happened.
You say that, just moving on to the Attorney General and the throne speech. The throne speech, and this is something I guess you've got strong opinions on in terms of the sex offenders register and stuff. The throne speech said that when sex offenders have been tried and convicted, to help prevent the tragedy of sex crimes being repeated, the government will selectively release information pertaining to sex offenders to members of the public. Is that enough? What would you like to see in terms of the sex offenders register? Because it's a very small island, it's a very touchy subject.
Yeah. I mean, first I'd really like to say that there's no one silver bullet to solving this problem. Okay, so the sex offenders list is a part of a whole framework of protecting children. Okay, so the sex offenders list, policies and procedures, background checks, reference checks, police reports, behavioral changes, educational training are all part of creating a protective environment for our children. And we also recognize that in order to create a protective environment, including all those variables, we have to work in collaboration with all the helping organizations that exist in Bermuda, whether it's the AG's chambers, whether it's the current government, the previous government, whether it's other social organizations like the Coalition for the Protection of Children, Child and Family Services, the Family Center, the Center Against Abuse. It takes a collaborative effort. What we say is tackling this crime is not just one organization or one person's issue, it's a community issue. And so we approach child protection and our view of that from a perspective of collaboration. And so we do have our opinions on what we think are gaps in the current framework and where we should go, and the sex offenders list. And we are supportive of having a sex offenders list. And so, that's our position.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, SCARS cares about children and the protection
Well, this
of
is
children.
it, isn't it? Because there is a fear around the sex offenders register that it could lead to identification of the victim, and some people will say that's the most important aspect of this.
100%. And our family went through this. And I can tell you that when our family went through this, back in 2004, the last thing we would have wanted was the person that harmed my children's name in the paper, because the press then put the relationship to that person to the children, and right away it would have identified who my children were. And at that point in 2004, they had not been on their journey of healing, and our family hadn't had the healing, and there's so much shame around this issue. And so the last thing you want is, more trauma. And so we have to be very cognizant about naming people that can identify the children. It's not about the perpetrator, it's about identifying the children. And also, I think we also have to be, think about the families of the perpetrators. They didn't ask for this. It's not their fault that their family member or somebody that they love in their family harmed a child, and they're not responsible for that. And I think we have to take that into consideration. We don't think that the offender's name has to be put in a paper until after they get out of incarceration, because they're not a threat to children in prison. There are no children in prison. And so what would be the purpose of that? Now, when they get out of prison and they've had no treatment, and there's nobody that has said that they are now safe to be in the community around children, then I think the community needs to know. And
how does it need to know? How can it know in a way that doesn't identify the victim in a place as big as Bermuda?
Well, if they're in prison for 6 months, that might be difficult. But if I don't know how long it takes to help the mind of a sex offender. That's the professionals. I don't even know how we sentence sex offenders unless we know how great the risk is. So we shouldn't be handing down 6-month sentences, 18 months, 3 years, until they are properly assessed by somebody who understands. How long have they been doing this? How old are they? What treatment have they had in the past? Have they confessed? How does one change if they don't confess they have a problem? They're not ready to get out if they haven't said, I have this problem. And I think that needs to be by a panel of professionals, not just one person saying, I think this person is no longer a risk. And who's going to take that responsibility to say they are no longer, because the most important thing is, will they be a risk to children when they get out? Because the life has changed forever, Jeremy. There's no do-overs with sexual abuse.
So this is an interesting point you raised, because the issue of the sex offenders register is very, very emotive indeed. And you get an alleged paedophile released back into the community, the uproar is the community needs to know. But you touched on a point about treatment and the panel, and you touched on a point about maybe gaps in the system. Which is more important, to actually get these things in place that you've identified, or the sex offenders register?
Well, these are the things that we've been, we think the process, there is a process that has to be followed, and there's things that we have to do. We are here now, okay, and we recognize that there are gaps, and I think through the AG's presentation and the report, they recognize that there's gaps as well, okay. So we are here now. So we have to put stopgap measures in place now to protect children. And then we have to talk and have that conversation about what can we do to minimize those gaps in the system to ensure that we're continually progressing this conversation to a point where we know and we have a framework in place that can manage the release of sex offenders. And that's a much bigger conversation, because we talked about mandatory rehabilitation. We know currently the system offers that as an option. So they can opt to take rehabilitation or opt not. And if you opt not to go through the process of rehabilitation, then there's a prescribed method of things that you have to follow, which means you serve your full sentence and you can appear before the probation board for consideration, but you still have to serve your full sentence. I mean, if you opt for rehabilitation, then there's a slightly different framework. And so we have to talk about what are the gaps in the process? What are the things that we can do to strengthen the release of sex offenders around just rehabilitation alone, in order so that when they are reassimilated into the community, and we've minimized that risk. So these are parts of the conversation that we have to talk about. And you're right. It's not just focusing on the sex offenders list, but you have to start somewhere, and you have to know what your end game is in order to continually progress that conversation to ideally create an environment.
Yeah, and in the meantime, organizations can do everything they can to minimize risk, because we know that not all sex offenders are at Westgate. They haven't been caught. And so they are out in the community. So we need to do everything we can by learning all the steps. So that means talking to our children about their bodies, talking to our children about sex, telling our children that nobody has the right to make them feel uncomfortable in their bodies, and that they can come and tell us if someone has, and make them feel comfortable being able to tell them, the best protection for children is the relationship with their parents. Really, that's one of the best. They can come and tell you anything about anyone. And so there are things that we can do outside the sex offenders list that will continue to protect children. We can talk about it. We can put policies and procedures in our organizations. We can do everything we can to minimize risk. We can react responsibly when it happens and hold people accountable. So there's all these other things that we can do. And in the meantime, really think about what is the best way to protect children in our community from the people that abuse children when they get out of do they get out of
One of the
custody?
things I also want
Relief.
the public to be aware of, I mean, we're focusing on the sex offenders list, but our reality is that, and this is a statement that we make, do not assume that someone's social standing in the community will make your child safe. Statistics will tell us more than 90% of the time the typical perpetrator is known to their victim. Okay? And so the idea of stranger danger is less of a risk to our children. And so when you start thinking about child protection and that fact, 90% of the time the perpetrator is someone you know, love, and trust. What does that say about child protection? And so, again, as Debbie said, it's not always the people that are, on the sex offenders list. I mean, we have to continually be vigilant about creating a child protective framework and environments for our children. And again, there's just no one silver bullet to solving this problem. It's something that we have to do 365 days a year, 24/7.
And we would really like to see if there's such a thing, is a recovering sex offender, child sex offender, start an organization that will help other sex offenders, because they need support as well. It's just like how an AA program works, or people who have been through other difficult times in their life, starting a support group for that. They need support as well. They need to manage their thoughts. So why hasn't that happened?
Yeah, why hasn't that happened?
I don't know.
Sometimes the obvious things are a statement of the best things are a statement of the obvious. That seems to be
right. But that would take a lot of bravery. Think about admitting that you have sexual thoughts of children. That takes a lot to be able to.
Controlled atmosphere.
100%. And so I think, just like a recovering alcoholic can understand what an alcoholic goes through, a sex offender will be able to understand how those thoughts and hold other sex offenders accountable. They need the support when they get out, because those thoughts will come, and they have to know what tools they use to help those thoughts.
And I think that's very important about the work that we do in the community. Yes, our primary focus is on prevention and providing the community with tools, but we also feel that an integral part of really addressing this issue as a community is we do have to provide the tools, either through rehabilitation and support for those that have been convicted or those that have this issue. Until we really create, I guess the best word would be is a holistic point of view about dealing with this issue, we're still going to have gaps. And I think now that we are having this conversation, we're talking about prevention, we're talking about child protection, and we're talking about rehabilitation. The interesting challenge, we'll see how all the collaborating partners that I talked about, really steer the narrative in how we can really advance this issue in Bermuda.
That's quite interesting you say that, because part of what the AG did say, and I'll quote, she said, our policies should be based on solid data, but at the moment we are challenged by multiple agencies collecting data rather than having one source of data. This is because each agency is looking for information specific to its area of operation. So an immediate challenge is to compile sex offender data so it's consistent and useful for policy development. What were your thoughts when you read that?
So my thoughts, I found that very interesting, and not to be controversial in any way, but we know that there's only two organizations that you can file a report, and those two organizations are the police and Child and Family Services. So to me, the ideal repositories for data collection would be those two sources. But we do know that there is a network, and she goes on to say court services, family
Police,
services,
Department of Corrections, magistrates,
and they
courts,
too
etc.
are active well within the ministries. And so that the focal point of primary data collection is well within the scope. And so I don't, given my knowledge, I don't see that as something that would be a daunting task to really channel in providing statistical data. I know that Child and Family Services are already collecting data, and they've reported on such. So I think the challenge for me would be just developing the framework. I mean, the repositories are kind of already defined in collecting that information. They're a tight network group that are part of the process, and I just think it's how it's all channeled.
And the other thing is, SCARS is going to be collecting our own data because we're going to be partnering with the Bermuda Health Council. We did a presentation there, and they realized how very important this issue is in collecting data of survivors. And so we've trained over 6,000 adults, and we're going to be sending a survey. It will be a choice whether any people want to take that survey. That's a choice. And but that's going to be the way we're going to collect data on how many survivors do we have in this country, how many girls, how many boys, how many times were they affected, what was the relationship to the offender, to the child. And there's going to be a questionnaire going out to our 6,000 stewards, and hopefully people will feel empowered to provide this information so that we can get real numbers, because like I said, the only way we collect information on this issue is through retrospective studies.
Yeah, just move on to a couple of other issues that you identified in your annual report, and we're looking to the future. But before we do that, you say on your website, you said our vision is to have a community without child sexual abuse, and we are doing everything we can to end the shame and pain associated with this issue. Do you think that's ever going to happen, realistically?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to use a term that's probably not, accepted by everybody, but there is evil in the world. I mean, not everything in life is good. Cancer isn't good. Divorce isn't good. Sexual abuse isn't good. And so I believe if there's a good, there's got to be something there. I mean, if there's all these things happening, there has to be some evil. So I don't know if we'll ever really stamp it out, but I think that we can drastically reduce the risk of it through education and awareness.
Yeah, I would say, can we ever eradicate child sexual abuse? And to be honest, the answer is no to that. But our endeavor is to eradicate it. And we will do everything in our power, whether it's through training, spreading the message, that will move us closer to that. And so I do think that as an objective, whilst we will always be moving in that direction, will we ever get there? That's our hope. We will.
That's your mission.
Yeah.
Last year, you met the Chief Justice, Ian Cabley, and in your report it says to express concerns about children testifying in courtrooms and facing their alleged perpetrators without a screen or the ability for proceedings to be video conferenced, subsequently causing re-traumatization. How have you managed to progress with that? Has anything changed there? Because I've been sitting in court cases as a reporter, and you see the trauma that it causes and the difficulty in testifying.
Yeah, well, what drove me to meet with him was because I sat up there and watched a case, and this young girl was re-traumatized over and over again, and there is something written in the policy that says that video conferencing can be used and should be used, but not in all cases, apparently. My meeting with him was just to really express how I felt emotionally about watching this take place in front of my eyes with this child, and it should not happen ever. No child should have to face a perpetrator, and I know that defense lawyers have a job to do, and they need to that they are the advocate for the offender, or for the person, or the accused, I should say. They're not an offender until they get proven otherwise. But there was no advocate for the child, because if there was an advocate for a child, that would have never happened. They would not be allowing a child to be questioned and face the accused. And so it is written in the policy, apparently. I don't know if the machine is working right now, but apparently a lot of cases are done through Skype now. Right. But I think they're working. People are aware now that this should not be happening, and I think that the courts are working.
So there is some progress.
There is some progress in that, absolutely, and hopefully we'll see legislative change, hopefully this year, where it will be video conferenced, or at least a screen. But I do know that some of the cases now they're doing it through Skype.
And the other thing, one of your aims, looking forward on your aims this year, is to research the development of a child advocacy centre. Have you managed to make any progress? And what's the idea behind this?
Yeah, To be quite honest, the Child Advocacy Center has always been an aim of our organization from day one. And so we are continually moving our organization, having discussions, and doing the appropriate work to assess what that should and could look like here in Bermuda.
And if we need one.
And if we need one, you know.
Right.
I mean, there are a lot of pieces in place currently. And so, to be fair to the process, you know, we felt that it was important to really do our due diligence as it relates to this issue. And so that's what we're doing. You know, it's a day-to-day process. So yes, as an objective, we are working to determine whether Bermuda needs a CAC, and if not, what does the child protection environment look like in the context of the services that a CAC should provide? Where are they housed? Who's responsible? And we think the key thing here is just accountability on the issue of child protection when it comes to child sexual abuse.
And an advocate. You know, right now, if you have a child that has to go through a child sexual abuse case, you know, you go to one building and you report it, and then you go to another building and you get interviewed, and then you go to another building and you get through the prosecution, and then you go to another building and you get healed. We just feel that, because they do this in the States, that, you know, one building with all the entities meeting regularly, so that child has a team of advocates going through that entire process. Not only the child, but the family of the child have a team of advocates with, you know, litigation, you know, prosecution. There's just this team of advocates, social worker. It's all the entities that we have now, but they'll just be all under one roof.
Actually, it's a good point. We've talked about the victim. We haven't talked about those around the victim. How do you help them, the families, who are going to be traumatized by this as well? They're going to blame themselves, presumably, most of the time.
Yeah, obviously, the focal point is focusing on the victim and the support and rehabilitation. But the crime of child sexual abuse visually can be seen as like a ripple effect. Okay, it's not just about the victim. Right? It is about the victim's family, and it just continues to ripple. And as I said earlier, you know, dealing with this issue is not my problem, your problem, just the victim's problem. It's a community problem in how we address this. And so, yes, the child is traumatized, but so is the family, because we recognize with the crime of child sexual abuse, sometimes the reporter or the child has to make the conscious decision that the outcome could destroy a family. And think about the burden that has on the mindset of a child or a person filing a report. And who wants to really accept that responsibility? That's huge. And this is why many times it goes unreported, because of the impact that it can have. Remember, more than 90% of the time, the crime is someone that we know, love, and trust.
Yeah.
And so it really makes this difficult. And difficult is an understatement.
And families do need help with this, because speaking from experience, you know, there's a lot of guilt that comes with it. There's a lot of shame that comes with it. What could I have done better? Why did this happen? How could this have happened? And there is a scar left behind on the family and on the victim, and also on a perpetrator's family. You know, everybody is scarred. Nobody comes out of this winning. And people's lives can be changed forever. And that's why prevention is key.
Really. I mentioned at the very beginning that you're quite a young charity still, and it is your 6th anniversary coming up later this month on the 27th of October. Have you got a fundraising event? Tell us all about your fundraising event.
But what I would say, I mean, in all honesty, we may be young in years, but I just have to give credit where credit is due, because I'm sure Debbie will confirm this, right? This is an issue that, you know, Debbie has been championing long before SCARS was started, okay? And so she has been the guiding light to advocacy on this issue, and it hasn't been 6 years. As an organization, yes. And we have spent most of our waking hours either talking about or working with making sure that this message gets out there to the community, and people are trained and they have the tools. And we won't stop until, and Debbie says this all the time, until everyone has been trained.
But tell us about your anniversary and how people can help you raise money.
Yeah, so we have a fundraiser coming up on October 27th. We're just kind of like organizing it right now, but it is going to be on October 27th. The tickets are available on PTix. It is called a country night. We're celebrating country. That's because my brother, Glenn, has a country band, and he's offered his service for free. And we're a charity. So we're very grateful to Glenn, Coco, and the Travelers Band. And so they're going to be playing. We also have an auction. We have great food that's going to be provided by Docksiders. Sorry. I'm sorry, I had a brain freeze. We have auction and prizes and raffles, and it's just going to be a fun night to celebrate our 6th anniversary, but also to help us fundraise to raise more money so that we can continue our work in our community.
And before then, you got one other event on the 21st of October, the community training scheduled for that day at the Argus building. What's that about, and how can people get involved in that?
The Argus community training is really our Stewards of Children Darkness to Light certified program, which provides you and teaches you how to recognize, prevent, and react responsibly to the crime of child sexual abuse. And it's based on 3 fundamental principles, which is making choices, taking risks, and supporting each other. And within that framework, we have a 5-step process that we use to educate the public. And those 5 steps basically are learning the facts, minimizing opportunity, talking about it, recognizing signs and symptoms, and reacting responsibly to the crime of child sexual abuse. So that's the aim of that community training. And in line with our fundraiser, I think it's important for the public to know, and it has always been our mission, that no adult should have to pay to be trained to protect children. And so, it is our aim to continually offer this service to the community free of charge. But it's really important to recognize that whilst we offer this to the community free of charge, there is a cost to providing this service. And we have been fortunate and blessed enough to have organizations and individuals within the community that believe and agree with the work that we're doing. But I would like to submit to the community, if you believe and agree with the work that we're doing, we would be happy to accept any donation to our organization, and it can be done through our website by offering a donation to the work that we do.
Yeah, and the reason that we don't charge is because we don't want there to be a barrier for anyone not to hear this message. And so we will continue to raise funds so that nobody has to pay for that. That's why we do what we do, because the most important thing is children to be protected in our community.
I think that's a good note to end this on. Thank you very much for your time, John and Debbie.
Thank you
very much for joining us.